Okay. Well, again, welcome everybody. Um, the goal of these uh, Zoom classes will really as I mentioned in our in-person class, the goal here will be to really focus attention on the assignments, um, review or go over the material that is relevant to each assignment, uh, and look at the example together, and then address any specific questions you have either about the assignment or about your passage or anything really that comes to mind. So that's our goal and objective in these sessions really is to end up covering the different assignments and make sure it's clear for everybody and to address any concerns or questions. So with that, let me pull up. All right. So today we're just going to cover the first two assignments, just the first one briefly, and then go through the second one, review a few of the key details. And some of this you'll remember from class. It should hopefully be fresh in our memories, but the point of doing this is to really make sure because I know there was so much that we covered together last week, so much happening that it was hard to remember and absorb everything that was discussed. So in this format, we'll be going a little bit slower, just taking it a piece at a time each week that we are able to meet. So there will be some interruptions in the schedule as I'll be traveling a trip to Malaysia planned in a couple of weeks, and then I'll be in Turkey and Pakistan in July. So there's going to be some interruptions, but we will cover all the assignments, Lord willing, and so you'll be able to have a reference to that as well. Okay. Again, let's take a look then to this morning. We'll cover, Lord willing, assignments 2.8 and 2.9. And if you'll remember, uh, or for first, we want to just cover what we want to look at today, which is discuss the class schedule, the assignments, and then quickly review the first exegetical assignment to read and observe Ruth or Jonah, and then want to look at the background context assignment of Ruth and Jonah or Jonah. And that's assignment 2.9. I have uploaded all the assignments. They're in Canvas, so you're welcome to work ahead, to work at your own pace on that. But we'll just go through the assignments in these Zoom classes in a sequential fashion. And just to remind us of the schedule, the plan here anyway, is we already did this first item. That was the in-person module, should say module 2, class in person along with the preaching labs. We'll be doing classes by Zoom from now into November, again with some breaks, some gaps in there, depending on my schedule. Then by November 30th, keep that date in mind, all Module 2 assignments are due, and that includes the sermon manuscripts. Because, as we discussed the last day of class, our next module, should put Module 3, will be December 9th through the 14th. So that's a Monday to Saturday. And we'll be covering the next module, poetry module, and you'll be preaching your narrative sermons. All right, that's coming in December. So that may seem like a long way off, but it will get here before you know it. So you'd be working on the assignments so you won't be behind. And then around May next year, so around a year from now, we'll be planning on doing module 4, which is the prophecy module. So just keeping that in mind going forward. But the important thing I want you to keep in front of you is the module 2. You need all the assignments completed for your 2 Old Testament passages by November 30th. Okay, so that's still more than 6 months away. So there's plenty of time. Okay. All right, now let's dive right in to the first assignment. Of course, should be very familiar with this by now, but this is what we looked at in class this last week that we were together. And this is just an overview of the entire process from beginning to end. So it incorporates the first 3 steps, which focus on the book, analyzing the book, and then the next 6, really 5 steps, focus on the story. All right, that you're studying. So, and the additional step was this narrative analysis step that we looked at. And all of that, all the first 8 steps will bring us to the exegetical idea, the author's main point of the story. And following that, then we have the 5 steps, which lead us to preparation for the sermon, preaching of the sermon. Okay, so what I'd like to do this morning is, and here's just an overview picture. This is in your syllabus, but this gives a more visual representation of the process overall. And what I'd like to do is now focus attention on that first assignment. We'll just take a moment to review and remember this is a read and observe Ruth. Now, a couple of you have actually already turned this assignment in. So I'd like to commend the 2 who have done that. But the read and observe step is, fairly straightforward, especially for Ruth and Jonah. They're both very small books, just a few chapters. So it won't take as long to do those assignments. The background context, the textual flow of the book will take a little longer. So let's remind ourselves, what is the goal of this first step? To read and observe the book. What are we wanting to do? What is the intent of this particular step? All right. Resty, you want to try to answer that? What's the goal of the first step here? What do we want to do?
Well, it's just to familiarize the the book, uh, be able to understand the whole scripture.
Yeah, get familiar with the book. I mean, that's the basic idea, right? To sort of have an idea, a picture, a understanding of the book as a whole. But we're just getting familiar with with the narrative, with the whole book. And so to get that, to become familiar, we need to encourage in ourselves active reading. And so that is really again, the goal is to become familiar with the book through active reading. And so we want to read through it. And as we read through it and get more familiar with it, then we're trying to look for how the stories given in the book fit together and just begin to develop that picture. Remember, then I use the illustration of a puzzle. These first 3 steps in the exegetical process are like basically trying to give us an image of what does the whole puzzle look like? What does the whole book look like? And so reading is that first step that we want to consider. And the best way to read, again, is active. And so we want to encourage active reading. So in this step, as we did with the epistles, we will do the same thing with narratives. That is, we'll read through the whole book several times. And I would encourage that reading in different translations. And then make specific and general observations from the book as we are reading it. Again, specific observations would include trying to identify the author and the audience, though that can be more difficult with narratives compared to epistles. Noting the people mentioned in the book, the places, the nations, the groups of people, identifying what might appear to be significant themes or structure. And again, we're not interpreting it now. These are just things to look for to help us be active in our reading of the book. Record the repeated words or synonyms in the book. All right, and so that's what we're after for this. And again, for Ruth or Jonah, this step should not take too long. Now, when we do the Gospel of John, that's going to take a little bit more time and effort to do this particular step. Now, also remember, general observations, specific observations include these things that I just mentioned. And then we also want to read through the book and just make general observations. That is, anything that catches your eye, anything that draws your attention, whether it's something that doesn't make sense, something that's interesting, something, a pattern you notice, repeated words, connections to stories within the book or other things outside of the book, other books of the Bible, just anything that comes to your mind. Again, active reading is sort of just being engaged, being focused on what you see in the book. And so I have found that this step really is making these observations really helps to encourage my engagement with the book and also getting familiar with the book. Because the more I'm looking for things and noting things and seeing things, the better acquainted I become with the book. And that's, again, the goal of this particular step. And so let me just pull up the assignment itself for you. And if I can find it here, what did I do with it? All right, give me a moment to locate. It's 2.9. Where's 2.8? Okay, here we go. All right, this one. Okay, so this is the actual assignment. So when you go onto Canvas and you hit Get Started, or if you go onto Canvas, you'll see the when you hit that assignment, you'll see the download, just like we've done already for Module 1. And you'll pull this assignment up. And it's going to look very, very similar to, I note here, it's nearly identical to the one you did for Colossians in Module 1. And so you're going to be kind of doing the same thing. It's just this time it's going to be looking at story. So first, I want you to read through the book several times, and I want you to note how many times you read it. I recommend, more than 5 times. As I mentioned in class, Pastor MacArthur has made it a habit to read through the book he's studying 30 times. So that'll be easier to do with Ruth or Jonah. It'll be a little bit more challenging with a book like John, but at least Ruth or Jonah, read it several times, at least 10 times, go through it. And I would encourage reading it in these different translations, again, just for the variety to help encourage the active reading. And then what I want you to do is make observations from the book. First, specific observations, just like we did for Colossians. Can you identify the author? Who do you think might be the author? Does the author refer to himself in the book? How about the audience? Is it possible to determine perhaps who the original audience was? What places are mentioned in the book? And for both books, there's not going to be that many places mentioned, all right? But what ones do you notice? What people do you notice mentioned in the book? What seems to be significant themes in the book? What did the author, why did he write the story? Again, you may or may not be able to come up with those answers. These are just questions to sort of guide a more active reading. So if you can't find them or you're just, guessing, that's fine. Again, the idea is not we're not doing the interpretation at this point. We're just trying to get familiar with the book. Step 8 here, number 8, what words are repeated? And again, that can include synonyms. So it doesn't have to be the exact same word, but if the words that are similar or synonymous, just note those for the whole book. And then after these specific observations, make general observations. And what I would like you to do is, again, just like I asked you to do in Colossians, for each chapter, reread the chapter and spend a little bit of time and make at least 5 observations and ask 2 questions. Okay? And most of you guys did an excellent job with this when we did Colossians. So it's just going to be the same approach. Just look through. And here you're not just summarizing verses. Again, it's not just, oh, he said this in this verse. He said this, that in this other verse. But what you're looking for is just, again, anything that sticks out to you that you notice. All right. And then ask at least 2 questions from each chapter. Right, you're going to do this for each chapter. So both Ruth and Jonah have 4 chapters. So you'll do it either for Ruth or for Jonah, whichever book you have the assigned passage from. All right, so don't just do this for your chapter that's assigned to you. Do this for all the chapters in the book. Notice I highlight that for each chapter. Make at least 5 observations and ask 2 questions. All right. Questions on this? Hopefully it should be straightforward, but just wanted to make sure to cover it. Anybody have a question? Easy, right? No problem. You should be able to do this right after we're done here today. You can take just a, no problem to get it done. One of the easier assignments. The next assignment, assignment 2.9, that'll now be a little bit more challenging, take a little bit more time. So I wanted to spend the rest of our time together just focusing attention on that particular assignment. All right, unless there's any questions that you guys have from what we've covered so far. All right, you guys are a lively, talkative bunch this morning, so we'll just I'll have to calm down a little bit so we can move to the next topic here. Good morning, Nell. I see you there hiding inside. The Tacloban Mafia is in the house. All right, where did my... Okay, we looked at that. Okay, here we go. Assignment 2 and this should say 9. Background context of Ruth or Jonah. Okay, now we're going to get a little more focused. So the first step was more general. First step, we're just getting familiar with the book. So it's a pretty open-ended, more general. Now we're getting more specific and we're looking at, we just want to understand the background context of the book. And if you remember, that deals with the sort of the setting of the whole book. Okay. And it's really kind of the specific observations that I asked you to make, but you're going to kind of go back to those and do a more expanded treatment of them. Okay. And I gave you this table. It's in your syllabus. I'll put it in the notes from the Zoom class here as well. But these are just some guiding questions for you to consider as you go through and look at the background context of the book. Now, for Ruth and Jonah, I should have added for the book of Ruth, the book of Judges will be a helpful backdrop for the book of Ruth. For Jonah, the book of Kings may have some details that will be helpful in understanding the background of the book. So that gives you a little bit of a hint as to when each of those books, what events they cover. All right. And so these will just be some guiding principles. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna use the book of Luke as an example in how to do this, what to look for. Okay, so we're gonna take a few minutes and just look at Luke and kind of go through. And if we were doing this background context on the book of Luke, what would we be looking for? Okay, so with that, I'm gonna ask for some help here to do some reading. Um, Liam, I'm going to ask if you could read Luke 1, 1 through 4 here.
Luke 1, 1 to 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, handed them down to us. It seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in orderly sequence. Most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty about the things you have been taught.
Okay, so here, are we told, does the author give his name? Right, as we look, we don't see that, but he does write here in the first person, right? Notice he says the things have been fulfilled among us. It seemed fitting for me, having investigated, to write out so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. So, and again, he says, handed them to us. So this is in the first person. He doesn't give a specific name, but the author does directly speak in this book. So before he gets into the story, to the narrative portion, he writes this little introduction that gives us a little information about him, tells us who the main recipient of the book is, and even tells us the reason or the purpose of the book. So that's going to be helpful information. But first, we want to consider the author, and to do that, we have Luke is an interesting book because we have another book that is connected to Luke, and that is the book of Acts. We read this introduction, which I'm going to ask Chong if you could read this one from Acts 1, 1 to 2, actually.
Acts chapter 1, verse 1 to 2. The first account, O Theophilus, I composed about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up to heaven, after he had by the Holy Spirit given orders to the apostles whom he had chosen.
Okay, so what do we notice here? Again, we have, again, the first person pronouns. First account I composed. And then notice the recipient, O Theophilus. Okay, that should ring a bell because we had in the book Gospel of Luke mentions Theophilus. And so here we have a link between these two books. It tells us the guy who wrote Acts also wrote Luke. Really, a sort of almost a continuation. And the recipient of Acts was the same recipient as Luke, the Gospel of Luke. And so that's a very interesting feature. And so as you go through Acts, and we won't have time to look at everything, and I'll give you the notes here, and this will be in the assignment, by the way. But what's interesting is you go through Acts, we see that the author was with Paul in many of the trips, the missionary journeys that Paul took. For example, if we just go to Acts chapter 16, all right. Can you guys see on your screens the scripture passage there? Can you guys see Acts 16? Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Is it there on your screen? Okay. Thanks, Nancy. All right, so notice here, Acts 16, when Paul received the vision to go to Macedonia, a vision appeared to Paul in the night, and a man from Macedonia was standing, appealing to him. And when he had seen the vision, immediately, notice here, the author says, we sought to go into Macedonia. All right, so here we see the author included himself. And if you keep going, setting sail from Troas, we ran in the straight course from there, which is leading city and the Sabbath. They come, they meet Lydia. So the author of Acts was there when Lydia came to Christ through the message of Paul. And she prevailed upon us. All right, and so as you go through the book of Acts, you find several places where the author of Acts is part of the story of Acts. Acts chapter 20. These individuals, verse 4, and then he says in verse 5, these had gone ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. And we sailed from Philippi. All right, so Paul, he was again with Paul. You can track it all the way through here. But we, verse 13, going ahead, sailing from there, we arrived. So again, notice he is with Paul. He's one of his traveling companions. And even as we go to when Paul is in Rome, we find the author of Acts was there as well. He was on the ship that sailed to Italy. Remember the one that had crashed? Notice verse 4, we set sail. All right, so he was with Paul on the journey from Caesarea to Rome. And here's the storm that took place, and then they crashed on the shore. They were shipwrecked. You keep going all the way. They go to Malta. We learned the island was called Malta. And so, again, you get the point. Notice many times, we stayed there for 3 days. We came. So this presents us some interesting information. The author refers to himself in Acts 1, saying, I wrote previous account to you, Theophilus. And now he mentions we in several places, that he was with Paul in many journeys. And then, of course, he's with Paul in Rome. Let's see if there's a reference to him. I don't see it here, but I believe he was with Paul basically till the end of the book of Acts. Now, yeah, we entered Rome. There it is. Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who was guarding him. So the author of Acts was at least went into Rome with Paul, and then probably was around while Paul was there in prison. So by doing this sort of internal investigation of Acts and Luke, we see there's a connection. The same author who wrote Acts wrote Luke. We see the link there between the recipients. We see some details within the book that the author was one of Paul's traveling companions. Why does that matter? Because if you study all of the epistles and look at the names mentioned in the epistles and as Paul's co-workers, as his ministry partners, those guys who are mentioned in that way, and then compare with the names that we find in the book of Acts, there are only two which are in the epistles two co-workers of Paul's that are mentioned in the epistles, but are not mentioned in Acts. All the other names of Paul's associates or co-workers that are mentioned in the epistles are noted in Acts, except for two, Titus and Luke. Those are the only two guys that, as I can recall in my study, that are not mentioned in Luke by name, though they are mentioned as co-workers in the epistles. And so that gives us an indication that the author of Acts, and therefore Luke, is likely Titus or Luke. Now, Titus might seem more likely since Paul had written a letter to him. He's more discussed in the New Testament, but Luke actually is the best candidate for a few reasons. One is there's an emphasis on medical focus in the gospel. It's kind of interesting if you go through several passages in Luke which mention particular medical conditions, and you compare what Luke says about those conditions versus the other gospels, Luke seems to identify more details about the particular medical condition. In fact, in Luke 14:2, he gives a technical term for the medical condition of the man that was suffering from dropsy. So he actually notes the specific medical condition. In Luke 22, he actually indicates which particular ear that Peter cut off of the slave. He mentions several details. It's kind of funny that you remember the woman that was suffering from the blood flow, the hemorrhage that touched Jesus's garment. Remember that story? Jesus was on his way to heal, was it Jairus's daughter, I think, and some woman touched his garment. Well, Luke 8, if you compare his story with Mark 5, Mark 5 says that she endured much at the hands of the physicians, but Luke leaves that comment out. He doesn't mention how the doctors were not very helpful. So I don't know if he did that on purpose, but we know, by the way, Luke is a physician. That's what Colossians 4 tells us, Luke, the beloved physician. And so the Gospel of Luke seems to, and this is subjective, but seems to have a little bit more of a medical focus, which we would expect if a doctor wrote it. The other thing is that Luke's gospel is more formal, more technical, the Greek text. It's clear that a more educated person wrote Luke compared to the other gospels. Remember, Matthew was a tax collector. John was a fisherman. Mark was an associate of Peter, was a younger man. I don't know that we know his background, but Luke was educated. He was a physician. And so there's also some evidence there. And then finally, the early church tradition, almost unanimously, the early church fathers indicate Luke as the author. And so based on that external evidence, but also some of the internal evidence, we know for sure the author of Luke wrote Acts. And we can determine that the likely candidates are Luke and Titus, based on what I said about the names mentioned in the epistles. And then knowing Luke is a physician sort of leans us that direction. And then the early church affirmed Luke as the author of the book. So that we would only know from looking at like a encyclopedia or an introduction to the book of Luke and a commentary. They might mention that. Okay. So that's just an example, guys, of doing a thorough investigation of the book itself. And in this case, we would add the book of Acts, knowing that link exists between the two, and just doing an investigation in the book. And you can find information like, for example, when you do your study of the Gospel of John, pay particular attention to John 21. There's several details includes in John 21 that helped us to narrow down the possibility of who authored that book. And so you'll want to take note of that when you do the background context there. Now, for Ruth or Jonah, we don't have as much information like we do for Luke or for John, but just go through the book, and with the book of Jonah, there will be a reference in Kings that you can take note of. The book of Ruth, we don't have a lot in terms of who might have written it, except that there is a clue if you look at the end of the book of Ruth as to when it was written. Okay, and in what general time period the book was written. So that can tell us a little bit. But just get into the practice of examining the book itself. And a lot of times you'll get helpful information and clues that will guide you to some insights about the author or the recipients. Okay, and so noting that Luke is the most likely author of the Gospel of Luke, we can then look to, there are a few references to Luke in the epistles. Let me pull those up. Oh, where are we at? Okay, here, yeah, we're here. So the name Luke, by the way, Luke is a Greek name, and Theophilus, as we're going to learn in a little bit, the recipient is also Greek, which brings up a little bit of trivia, an interesting. So maybe I'll pose you the question. We'll see. I'll give you bonus points if you can answer this. Who is the most prolific author in the New Testament? Who wrote the most books in the New Testament? Anybody?
John.
John wrote the Gospel of John, Revelation, and then 3 epistles. So he's got 5 books. Has anybody written more books in the New Testament than 5?
Paul.
Paul, yeah.
Paul.
How many did Paul write?
13 letters.
13 letters. Okay. Now, here's the trivia question. Okay. Paul's the most prolific writer. He wrote the most books in the New Testament. Who wrote the most words in the New Testament? What author wrote the most words?
Luke.
Now, our first inclination might be Paul. But it actually is Luke. Luke wrote slightly more words than Paul. I think Luke accounts for, I forget, 24 or 25% of the New Testament, something like that. If you count all the words in Greek, the Greek words, almost a fourth of them, I think a little under 25% or around there, were written by Luke. So this is interesting. All the other writers in the Bible that we know of were Jewish, except one, Luke. And as it turns out, Luke was, in the New Testament, the most extensive writer, meaning he wrote the most in terms of words. And it was basically the most words written were by a Greek author to a Greek recipient, Theophilus. So it's kind of interesting. Don't preach a sermon on that and attach some, spiritual meaning, there's some deep truths here. But it's just kind of an interesting piece of trivia. Russell, did you have a question?
Pastor Tim, are you saying not repeated words?
Yeah, it would include repeated words, just all the words that were written. And I don't remember how many specific words, but yeah, it would include any words that are repeated. It's just how many words did Luke write? Well, he wrote more words than any other single author in the New Testament. So even more words than Paul. Paul wrote more separate books, more distinct epistles. Luke only wrote 2 books. Paul wrote 13, but Luke wrote more in terms of the number of words used. So the longest book in the Bible is the Pentateuch. All right, that's the most words of any book, even more than the Psalms. And the Psalms really aren't one book. It's a collection of independent poems. But as far as the New Testament is concerned, Luke is the most extensive writer in the New Testament. Okay, you can put that on your assignment if you want, but that was just, I just thought that was kind of interesting. Okay, so we do find Luke mentioned in a few places in the epistles. And in fact, maybe we can just take a look. Colossians 4:14. Notice it says, Luke, the beloved physician, sends his greetings. So here, as I mentioned earlier, here is where we see, here is where we see some details about Luke, that he is a physician. Philemon, he's mentioned in Philemon as a fellow worker. You remember I said earlier, fellow workers, co-workers that are mentioned in the epistles, like these guys, are also mentioned in Acts, but Luke is not. Luke is not mentioned in the book of Acts by name. 2 Timothy 4, verse 11 is another passage that mentions Luke. Only Luke is with me. So Luke was with Paul during Paul's second Roman imprisonment. So again, another interesting piece of New Testament trivia, that Luke was with Paul at his first imprisonment in Rome and also his second imprisonment in Rome. And it's believed that second imprisonment is when Paul gave Luke information and details and content regarding some of the material in the book of Acts. But much of the events that took place in Acts, Luke was part of them. He witnessed them himself, but some of the other things Paul had probably communicated to him from what he had experienced. And so also as well, we learn as we look at Colossians chapter 4, that Luke was not only a physician, but if we note there, these particular individuals that are mentioned here are described as fellow workers from the circumcision. So they are Jews, but then the names after that, Epaphras, and then Luke, Demas, those are Greek. Those are Gentiles. All right. So these are just to give us some details about the author, what we can learn about him, having determined that Luke is definitely the most likely author. We can then learn some details about him. Luke writes in a formal fashion in this book. We notice from the initial verses that he investigated everything carefully to write out in an orderly sequence, or I think that, what does the ESV say here? To write an orderly account. New American Standard, I think, said to write everything out in consecutive order. And so here we can see from those comments that Luke, the author, intended to lay out in probably a chronological, sequential, orderly fashion the events that took place in the life of Jesus. And what's interesting is Luke is very, very specific about connecting to historical events and individuals. Notice in verse 5 of chapter 1, in the days of Herod, king of Judea. And then if we go to chapter 2, It happened in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus for a census to be taken. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So these are some historically rooted individuals and events. And then even in chapter 3, he again makes an historical reference. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, Pontius Pilate was governor, Herod was tetrarch, Philip was tetrarch, during the high priest. This is a lot of historical detail. And that makes sense given what Luke said at the beginning of his gospel, that he wanted to lay things out in a consecutive order, having investigated everything carefully. Many call Luke the historian of the gospel writers because he took such care to connect to or identify particular historical figures, historical events linked to his book. And so that makes sense given what he told Theophilus he wanted to do, what his intent was in writing the gospel. Another detail we want to consider or take note of as we look at the introductory verses in Luke. Notice he says, those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants and handed them down to us. And then he says, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning. So here we see this idea of Luke indicating a careful investigation as he examined the events of this book. And likely then, he probably interviewed such people, perhaps, definitely, obviously Paul, but perhaps even Mary, may have been some of those that he interviewed, perhaps Jesus's brothers, some of the other women. So these eyewitnesses' accounts were likely from those who were actually there. And so Luke seems may have interviewed those individuals. Okay. So just some details to consider in looking through this particular gospel. Now, the recipient, I've already mentioned him by name, but again, notice who is it that this book was written to? In this case, Luke tells us he wrote to a man named Theophilus, which is Greek for lover of God. All right. And so this is the same guy, by the way, that was mentioned is in book of Acts. All right, so he's a particular individual, again, a Gentile, a Greek, given his Greek name. And notice too, what does Luke say about him? What is the title that he is given? See it there? He calls him most excellent, Theophilus. Why does he do that? What does this title indicate about Theophilus? Was he just being polite? What do you guys think? Anybody have a thought about that?
Yeah, Theophilus probably was one of the high rank in the Roman citizen or Roman Empire, who is Luke's patron for his research on the history of Christianity.
Yeah, he's likely a high-ranking Roman official, and the reason we would say that, or what would lead us to that, is that there are some examples. I think there's a cross-reference right here. I'll just look it up. When Paul addressed Felix, he called him most excellent governor Felix. And then when he addressed, again, he addressed Felix here as most excellent. And then later in chapter 26, he again calls him most excellent. And so we see this is a title given to Roman officer or to someone that's high ranking. Festus is here, most excellent Festus. So yeah, it's likely Theophilus was a Roman official, perhaps high in the government. And so Paul addresses him in a formal fashion with that particular title. Could have been a wealthy person who supported Luke. So we can at least know that about him. And also, too, Luke indicates sort of why he wrote this particular letter. What is the reason that he gives?
Verse 4.
Yeah. What does he say there?
So that you may know the certainty about the things you have been taught.
Yes. So we find out here this gospel was written. Luke wrote it to lay things out in an orderly, mostly chronological sequence with much detail, much investigation, because he wanted Theophilus to have assurance or certainty about what he had been told about Jesus. So Luke says, hey, I'm going to write out an historical account that will detail particular events in the life and ministry of Jesus in an orderly, well-investigated, sequential format, so that you can have assurance or be certain about the things you have been taught. Now, again, this doesn't mean that the Gospel of Luke is just a history book. As we talked about in class, Luke had particular themes and a focus and a message as he lays out that this historical evidence of Christ. And he wrote the book in order to give assurance. So there was a theological, there was a spiritual purpose behind the writing out of the historical events in Jesus's life. And so Luke tells us explicitly why it was he wrote that. Now, when you study Ruth and Jonah, and as you're looking for the recipients, we won't see the same level of detail and information that Luke gives us. And that's how it is with most narratives. But if you have an idea of when the book may have been written, that will help in determining the audience. Okay? So, for example, as we consider Ruth and Jonah, Ruth, paying attention to how the book of Ruth ends will give us an idea of the historical time in which it was written. As far as Jonah is concerned, knowing something about the prophet Jonah, and if he is the author, which I believe all the prophetic books were written by the prophet, Jonah is a likely candidate. If Jonah was the author, that would give us an indication as to when that book was written, because we know from Kings, there's a reference to Jonah in Kings that will give us that information. Okay, and that leads us to the next topic in the background context that we want to explore, that we want to investigate, and that is, if I can get to it here, the historical context. Okay, the historical context. So we talked about the author, the recipients, gleaning what you can from the book. That's all these details. Now we're interested in historical context. So if we want to go back and consider Luke, Gospel of Luke, Luke is the author, and pretty much he is by far the most likely author of the book. We know that he lived in the time period of the 1st century. And so we know the book must have been written in the 1st century. And we can use some knowledge of historical events to narrow down the time of writing. That must have been written before 96 AD, because Clement of Rome refers to the book of Acts in his writings, and that would happen in 96 AD. So there's a reference to the book of Luke in this particular year. And so we only get that from his external resources like the Bible Encyclopedia or something like that. It's likely written even before 70 AD because the fall of Jerusalem is not mentioned in Acts. Okay? Or Luke, for that matter. So it's very unlikely that the book had been written yet. Certainly, that would have been a major event and would most definitely have been included, at least in the book of Acts. But the book of Acts ends with Paul in prison in Rome, the first Roman imprisonment. It says the end of book of Acts says that Paul stayed there 2 years. So we know that basically the book of Acts ended with the end of Paul's first Roman imprisonment. So nothing's mentioned, though, about the fall of Jerusalem. Again, I mentioned that here. Acts was certainly written before Paul's death, which was listed by the early church as 68 AD. All right. And his first Roman imprisonment, which is where the book of Acts ends, as I mentioned. We can look at it here, Acts 28. Paul stayed 2 full years in his own rented quarters, welcoming all who came to him, teaching, and then the book ends. And that's the end of the first Roman imprisonment, which we can determine was around 64 AD. I don't remember in class if I went through, you really can pinpoint the particular years in the events of the book of Acts with just understanding a couple of key historical events that we know that are external to the book of Acts. One of those events is when the Jews were kicked out of Rome. That happened under Claudius in 49 AD. There's a reference to that in the book of Acts. So let me just show you that. This is that free stuff. Remember I told you guys you get free stuff here. You get lots of cool free things in this Taya course, okay? So your 3,000 pesos you're getting much more added value than 3,000 pesos, So one of the things, at least I thought this was kind of interesting. See if I can remember where it's at. Somewhere in Acts. Let me see. Let me do this. Yeah, here it is. Acts 18, verse 2. This is where Paul met Aquila and Priscilla. They recently came from Italy because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. Well, archaeologists have found a reference to this specific event in the extra biblical sources. And they've been able to pinpoint the particular year that this happened was 49 AD. And so here we have a time marker in the book of Acts, in Acts 18:2, that this took place, what I highlighted here, 49 AD. So you can, knowing that as a reference point, you can now go backwards and forwards in Acts and be able to figure out time periods. Because Luke mentions in Acts time that had elapsed and particular events and locations, or particular events and times and dates. So this is a very helpful reference point, Acts 18:2, to particular events, because we know where Acts begins, right? If you go back to Acts chapter 2, we know this is taking place Pentecost, right? Christ had just ascended. We know that was likely in 30 AD. So you've got Acts chapter 1 around 30 AD, Acts chapter 18 around 49 AD, and then we can figure out basically the book of Acts ends around 64 AD by just understanding the sequence of events in between. Okay? So that's a helpful reference point when you're trying to figure out dating in the book of Acts. The most likely time that Luke was written was during Paul's first imprisonment. Because again, remember, it ends in Rome. The book of Acts does. And Luke was written before Acts, but it's likely because Luke and Acts go together as sort of a 2-volume set written to Theophilus, they were probably written fairly close in time to one another. And as I note here, it's possible Luke sent his gospel to Theophilus before he went with Paul to Rome, or perhaps after they got to Rome. So some scholars have determined maybe Luke wrote the book of Luke while Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea, and then perhaps wrote the book of Acts a couple years later when Paul was imprisoned in Rome. We don't know for sure, but it seems to be a plausible. And that's important to remember then. So we're looking at a book written likely, you know, around 30 years after the events that are written within the book, at least the book of Luke. Book of Luke covers the events from Christ's birth to his death. So around 3 or 4 BC to 30 AD. The book of Acts covers events from 30 AD till around 64 AD. All right, so with Luke and Acts, we have coverage of events from Christ's birth all the way to the end of Paul's first Roman imprisonment, which is from 3 BC to all the way to 64 or so AD. Okay. All right. Okay, I know I'm doing a lot of talking. Any questions on that? Book of Luke, author, recipients, historical context. I'm just using this as an example to just show you the kinds of things you want to be doing when you're examining the background of a book. And each book's a little different. You know, Luke has some different features. Like I said, it has the book of Acts as the companion book, so we can gain information from that. So sometimes you'll have that situation. Sometimes, like in John, you'll have some details given that point to a particular author. Some books you just have to take note of certain things that are mentioned and what that might indicate about who the author might be, or at least what do we know about the author. Some books don't give enough, really that much information at all. But many books, we usually can determine the time period in which it was written based upon some internal statements within the book. Okay? But that'll be different with each book of scripture, the kinds of things that are mentioned in the book. I think we looked at like the book of Joshua, and it mentioned that Rahab was still alive. You guys remember talking about that in class? It's in your syllabus, but mentions in Joshua how Rahab, I forget what the reference is, but Rahab was, it says, you know, oh, let me look it up so I don't misspeak here.
Pastor Tim, it's in page 7.
On your notes?
Yes, Joshua 6 chapter 6, verse 25 indicates Rahab was still alive at the writing of the book, which means it must be less than 1,000 years from when they entered the promised land.
100 years, yeah. Yeah, here in verse 25, Rahab the harlot and her father's household, all she had, Joshua preserved alive, and she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day. Okay, to this day. So that indicates the time of the writing of the book. So that's one little statement mentioned in the book that you might not catch, you might not pick up unless you're reading carefully, but it does indicate, it may not tell us who wrote the book, but it does tell us when the book was written, or at least it narrows that down. So Joshua wasn't written, you know, much later in the time of the exile or or even in the time of the kings, it was written within a generation of the events of the book, because Rahab's still alive as of the writing of the book of Joshua. And even if she was a young woman when it began, you know, so the book had to have been written less than 50 years after the fall of Jericho, where Rahab's first mentioned. Okay, and so oftentimes, guys, you can, sorry, I didn't show you that. Okay, here we go. So yeah, I'm just highlighting here, Joshua 6:25, that one little statement there gives us a very great clue and indication as to when the book was written. Okay, and many books will have something like this. It just will take some effort on our parts to carefully explore. So if we have an idea of when the book was written, that opens up some helpful insights into the background of the book, and also then to whom the book was addressed. Because, you know, if we're looking at an Old Testament book, it's going to be some, you know, group of Jews at some point in time, most likely. Okay. So when you think about Jonah or Ruth, the author doesn't mention the specific audience, but given that it's a Jewish author speaking of Jewish events, it's likely a Jewish audience then in the time period in which that book is written. And if you can get an idea of the time period, then that helps us a great deal in understanding the background of when that book was written. Now, again, remember, we're dealing with two historical contexts. We're dealing with one, when, at what time was the book written? But secondly, the events within the book. When did those take place? And that's something you'll focus on when you do the setting analysis later. You'll look at the time period of the book. But with the historical context, you're focusing more on when the book was written. Why does that matter? Who cares? What's the difference? Well, you remember in class, we talked about that example between Kings and Chronicles. Two books that cover basically the same events, or they overlap significantly in the events they cover regarding the kings of Israel. Book of Chronicles focuses more on the kings of Judah, but it tells about the similar events, some of the time almost the exact same wording. And so you might think, well, what's going on here? Why do we have two books in the Bible that have a lot of the same things said? Well, as we mentioned in class, it's very, very important to understand when those books were written. And as I showed you, and you can go back to your syllabus and look at the details, I showed you from within each book, you can get an idea of when it was written. Kings, the last event mentioned in Kings is during the exile, when Jehoiachin was, I think, released from basically house arrest, and released by the king after Nebuchadnezzar. So that tells us that Book of Kings likely was written then during the exile, toward the end. However, the Book of Chronicles, we learn by a careful study of Chronicles, we see in one of the genealogies that the 8th generation after Jehoiachin is mentioned in one of those genealogies. So that tells us that the book was written then at least, 8 times what, 25, 150, 200 years, 150 years, or 200 after Book of Kings. So those are two completely different generations of Jews that are being addressed. And so even though the events within Kings and Chronicles are almost the same time period, covering the time of the kings, from David all the way up to the exile, but the audience then is going to be very different. The audience of Kings are the Jews that are in the exile. The audience of Chronicles are the Jews that are many generations after the exile. And so the issues and the concerns are going to be different. So really being able to identify as best we can when a particular book is written will really help us in discovering or identifying or knowing the background of the book, what the setting was, situation was for the recipients, the original recipients of the book. And that will help us in determining what really the purpose of the book is. As I mentioned with Kings and Chronicles and Kings, right, the purpose as stated in Kings in 2 Kings 17 or 18 is to really give the reason why the Jews went into exile. And really showing, chronicling through the history of the kings, this is how we ended up here. Whereas Chronicles, being written much later, probably addresses the people that may be wondering if they were still, part of God's plan, or if God now had forgotten them, and so Chronicles we see emphasizing the kings of Judah and really more on the positive events that took place than the kings. I think to send the message to the people in that day that God was still remembered them and was still going to keep his promises to them. So I know we talked about this in class, but I wanted to bring this back in because I'm really, really trying to emphasize to you guys the importance of trying to identify the historical context of when a particular book was written. And we talked about that for John as well, knowing that John was written, toward the latter part of the first century, probably 30 years, 25, 30 years after the last book of the New Testament was written, besides the epistles of John. But the non-John Johannine books, I think the last one is probably Jude, that many believe was written maybe around the late 60s. So we have then the Gospel of John, along with his letters and the Revelation of John, written maybe 20 years after that. That's important to know. Okay? So when you look at Ruth and Jonah, again, I think looking at the end of Ruth will give us some indication when the book of Ruth was likely written. And in Jonah, if Jonah is in fact the author, that would tell us when that book was written. Questions on historical context, or a joke you want to tell, or anything. Is there still life out there? Yeah, I know this is all riveting, engaging, unbelievable information. You can't get anywhere but here. And you guys are recipients of this today. Praise the Lord. So, all right.
Pastor
Yeah,
Tim,
Alan. Hi.
even though the historical account doesn't mention the author, can we give even a guess who is the author of that based on our study?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So you might say, the possible, you know, if you're studying Ruth, you know, possible, it seems that Ruth was written at this particular period of time. Some likely candidates, you know, could be, you know, and you could mention a couple of individuals and why you think that might be. In most cases, we won't be able to know with 100% certainty, but sometimes, you know, there are some pretty good guesses we can make. And like I say, in the case of Luke and John, the Gospels, we have a pretty strong indication of who wrote those. And then, of course, in the epistles, we know who wrote it. The author tells us his name explicitly. And then in the prophetic books, many of them, the author mentions himself explicitly. But yeah, if you have a guess, or sometimes you might read in the resources, it might indicate, you know, this particular person may have been the author. But feel free to.
But at this time, Pastor Tim, we are not yet allowed to have some consultations of other sources like commentaries like that. This
Yeah,
time. Still?
do your own study first, but for this step, I mean, if you just look at, you know, don't look at any interpretation of stories or anything, but if you want to get some background information, like from Bible Encyclopedia or, you know, Bible Hub. I think I showed you guys this, but here, let me do it now. If you go to Bible Hub here, and you go to topical top, just hit that, and then you know, let's say we want to look up Jonah. So I hit Jonah, and then notice here, Jonah, it mentions people. Jonah is mentioned. Now, Amittai, you go, I don't remember that in the book of Jonah. Well, you look it up and you'll see why that's there. Some places mentioned. Well, only Nineveh and Tarshish are mentioned specifically in the book of Jonah. But you can look those up for the information. And that kind of thing, you're welcome to use this resource for that as well. But I would not encourage you to be, you know, using commentaries at this stage right now. But if you want to look up like Bible Encyclopedia or something like that, that would be perfectly fine. Or the introduction in the commentaries. That'll have some information, historical information that you can use. But try to do as much as you can on your own. If you do use a resource, guys, make sure to note the resource you use. Just one, to give credit to that resource. Then also two, later on in your study, you may want to, you may want to know where that resource you used, so at least you'll have a reference there. Okay. So, all right. Any other questions?
Morning, Pastor Tim.
Hey, Nigel.
Yes, so far in my study, so this is in my own experience with Ruth. The question is, are there books in scripture where, yes, you have an approximate, like in the case of Ruth, it mentioned the book mentions David, so we know that it was written during or after the time of David, but we really can't zero in as to the specific circumstances of Israel. So at least right now in my study, I'm finding it difficult to pinpoint what the author's specific purpose was, because I mean, David's reign covers a long period. Does that happen in other portions of scripture also, or where you just can't know for certain what circumstances were surrounding the audience that it's writing.
Yeah, sometimes you're not going to get enough information to know exactly. But like in the case of Ruth, yeah, David's the last name mentioned. So yeah, it could have been written either during his reign or not long after. So that's probably the best we can do as far as narrowing down the time period of when the book was written. But what I've learned or noticed is the more you study a book and understand sort of the point of the book, the author's message, then sometimes that actually helps you to make a connection as to when it could have been written. But yeah, it's for most books, it's hard, unless you're in like the epistles, for example, or Acts, we saw, some books you can pinpoint just based on the events mentioned in the book, but not always.
So you look within the book for clues to primarily to come up with the purpose of the author.
Well,
That's
you
what you're
look,
saying, right?
well, there's two things. One, remember the occasion of the book, that is like what prompted him to write. The purpose of the book is what is the message of the book.
Sorry. Yeah, it's the occasion I'm struggling with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that sometimes you're just not going to know for sure. And that's okay. We just try to understand as best we can. Like in John, we can know the occasion of the book by seeing how he begins the book, by understanding the concerns that John writes about in the epistles regarding the person of Christ. And so we have clues to the occasion or what prompted John to write the gospel based on things like that. But many of the other narrative books, we may not have enough information to know exactly what prompted the author to write it. We can know the message of the book, the purpose, but the occasion sometimes will escape us. We won't be able to have enough information to be certain about that.
A related follow-up. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
A related follow-up question. Now that we're talking about this, so at the end, the genealogy of King David is mentioned, right? But the mere fact that the author no longer bothers to mention Solomon or any of the kings after David, is that silence sufficient evidence for us to say it could not have been written during the time of Solomon or after that? Or is that too, or am I making too many assumptions?
No, I think it's a reasonable conclusion, and you would just state it that way. It seems likely the book was written in the time of David, because nothing is mentioned about Solomon or any of the kings after. But even the focus of the book, and again, I don't want to give away too much, but the way that I'll give you this. Psalm 78. Right. Consider how Psalm 78 ends. The last few verses of Psalm 78 talks about King David. And just kind of look there, and that what's said about him there, I think, is a helpful insight into the message of Ruth. And I'll leave it at that.
All right.
I've already said too much.
Yes.
I've already disclosed too much information.
Thank you so much, Pastor Tim.
Thank you, Pastor.
and thank you for recording, Pastor Tim. I can just go back.
On behalf of everyone going through Ruth.
I better edit that part out. Okay. Russell, you got a question? Are you going to ask about Jonah? What about Jonah?
No, I just want to share the video that you sent us regarding how to discover intention of the book.
Oh, yeah. You mean from Dale Davis?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that also to discover the intention of the book. If they already listens.
Yeah, there's some good information there in that video. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. Thank you, Pastor Tim.
So yeah, for Jonah, in considering maybe the occasion, the time period it was written, I think the clue I gave already is, if you study all the prophetic books, and we'll get into this when we talk about the prophets. I'll give you more details, but when you study the prophetic books, I have found it's my conclusion that that the most likely author of the prophetic book is the prophet himself. And I can make a strong case for that in all but two of the prophetic books. Malachi and Jonah are the two that could possibly be written by somebody else. But I still think, based on the fact that all the other prophetic books, I can make the case that it's written by the prophet or only contains the words of the prophet. I think I believe Jonah is the most likely author of Jonah, and therefore that tells us the time period in which it was written. There's an interesting archaeologists found an inscription in it's today present-day Mosul, Iraq, but that used to be Nineveh. There's a dig that found an inscription that Jonah, that says something to the effect of the prophet Jonah. Some think it might have been a tombstone or a plaque dedicated to him. That actually it's a reference to Jonah. Some believe that, and this is not inspired, it's just interesting. Some believe that perhaps Jonah may have stayed in Nineveh. So that would be a neat fact if that is the case, that perhaps Jonah did have a change of heart. If he wrote the book of Jonah, and I think he did, that would indicate as well that perhaps Jonah finally got the message and that God did change his heart. That he was willing to write the book to tell about it. So don't know for sure. That's just, but that's your clue for Jonah. All right, so you guys got some help there with both of those books. But background is a little bit more challenging for the narrative books. It's a lot easier to get information for the epistles and even the poetry, the poetic books. It's a little harder with the narrative texts. All right, any other questions? Comments? We got a couple more steps here in the background context, but okay, well, let's cover those so I can let you guys go here. We only got a few more minutes left. Oh, okay. All right. Where are we? So now, social context, as I mentioned to you, that social context, you already noted when you did the observation step in the first assignment, you'll have noted already the names of people in the book. Here in the background context, we now want to find out about those people mentioned in the book. Okay. What do we know about them? So in the case of Jonah, your life will be easy. All right. You're going to thank me for giving you Jonah instead of Ruth, because Jonah really only has one name, one group of people, right? The Ninevites. I guess, you have the sailors as well there. And of course, if you want to try to find information on the big fish, that's another character mentioned in the book. You're welcome to do that. But I think his name was Morty or something like that. I don't know. Just a joke lang. But if in the case of Jonah, we just really have the Ninevites, Nineveh as the place. So you want to identify, okay, what do we know about Nineveh at that time? And again, that's where you could use like the Bible Hub, the Topical Bible Encyclopedia. It'll give references to Nineveh and other passages. Now for Ruth, a little more work is going to be involved because there's several names mentioned in Ruth. So what do we know about those people? Don't just list the names. You did that under the observation step in assignment 2.8. For this assignment, you're going to need to give more details about. So, of course, Ruth is mentioned, Boaz, Naomi. What do we know about them? And by the way, Ruth is mentioned outside of the book of Ruth, right? Where is she mentioned?
Matthew.
Yes, genealogy of Christ. So that's an interesting reference. Of course, we should know that just by knowing book of Ruth, seeing the genealogy at the end of Ruth, knowing she is in the line of the Messiah. But you're going to want to, for you Ruth guys, you're going to want to know, what do we know about those particular people or places mentioned in the book? You have Moab mentioned there, and that goes to the next step in the background context, is we're going to be looking not only at the social context, but also the geographical. What places are mentioned? What do we know about those places? Okay. So in a book like Jonah, we have Nineveh. So that's a location. What do we know about that place? For Ruth, you have Moab, you have Bethlehem. I don't remember if any other places mentioned there in the book. You have the threshing.
Ephrata?
What's that?
Ephrata? Is that
Yeah,
a place?
Ephrathah. Yeah, Bethlehem, Ephrathah.
Ephrata.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's part of Bethlehem. We have the threshing floor. That's a location. What do we know about threshing floor? So those are the few places you're going to need to identify. And then again, what do we know about those places? Don't just say Moab. What do we know about Moab? So again, you can use the topical Bible reference and Bible hub to guide you a little bit on that. Okay. And then finally, the last couple of steps, we have the cultural context. So again, what do we know about the culture? So if you're in Jonah, you're studying Nineveh, what do we know about the Ninevites? If you're in Ruth, okay, what do we know about Jewish culture in those days? And what cultural issues are identified or mentioned in the book? So in Ruth, we have the kinsman redeemer. We have the transaction with the sandal. We have gleaning. Some of those are cultural practices that you're going to need to identify. What do we know about the Ninevites and their culture? Okay. And finally, then the occasion of the book. What prompted the writing of the book? Now, Luke tells us what he was wanting to do with the book so that Theophilus would have certainty about what he'd been taught. For Ruth and Jonah, as Nigel was asking a moment ago, there may not be enough information to know with certainty what prompted the book to be written. But, feel free to, after your study of the background, present a possibility and why you think that. Okay. Again, remember the difference between occasion and purpose. The occasion of the book is what prompted the author to write it. The purpose of the book is what is the message of the book? What is the focus of the book? All right. And so what I put together for you is the assignment. This is the assignment for, oh, I'm sorry, Sonny, did you have a question?
A question related to the Book of Ruth, sir. Can we use or is it possible to use the Book of Judges as the background context of the Book of Ruth?
Yes, most certainly.
Since there's no mention of king there, the Book of Judges ended with the statement there is no king there, and so here comes the Book of Ruth. So something
Yes.
like that. So is it possible that we're gonna use that as a reference for our background studies of the book?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Book of Judges is a key book. I think I mentioned earlier you're going to want to be familiar with, because the book of Ruth opens with in the days of the judges. So that sets at least the events of the book, the time period there. Now, again, the historical background of when the book was written was likely at least a few generations later, because it mentions, right, Obed's son Jesse and then Jesse's son David. So we know that the book wasn't written in the days of Ruth. It was written in the days, at least, of her grandson, maybe even a little later. So, but the events in the book took place in the time of Judges. So yeah, when you go through the setting of the book, you're definitely going to be referencing Judges. But in this step, in the background context, again, the time that the book was written was a few generations after the time of the judges had ended. So let me show you guys. We'll be finishing up here. Here's the assignment. So when you open up, I put in the example. Again, you're only going to do this for Ruth or Jonah, whatever book you were assigned, whatever passage you were assigned. And I just put the example in of Luke. It won't be as long for you for Ruth or Jonah. All right. Luke had a lot more information, so that's why it's longer like that. Ruth and Jonah, you're just going to have a few statements for the author, the recipients, historical context, etc. All right. So then I put in a little space for you guys to input that information. Okay. And like I said, some of these things it may not be able. The author, we can't be certain necessarily. Recipients, we have an idea, knowing when likely the book is written. The occasion for the book, what prompted it to be written, we may not know explicitly, but you can, again, just propose what you think based on study of the book so far. Okay. All right. So that's the first two assignments for your Ruth or Jonah passage. We're just at the step now. We're just getting familiar with the book, looking at the background. Next week, Lord willing, we'll talk about the contextual flow of the book and what you need to do for that particular assignment. Okay. But these first three assignments are, relatively speaking, not going to be as long. When you get to the assignments after this, we do the narrative analysis. that's going to require a little more time and effort. So I would encourage you to try to get these first 3 assignments done sooner. Don't put it off, because you're going to need to give a little more time to the narrative analysis assignments, the setting, the scene, character, and the plot. Those are going to require a little more time, especially the scene analysis. So you're going to want to be prepared for that. Okay?
Okay, Pastor.
All right. Okay, good. And like I said, if you, as you're going through your study, if questions are coming up regarding your specific passage or the book you're studying from, you're welcome to ask during our time together here. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Pastor.
Thanks, guys. Pastor Dooney, let me ask you,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, can you close us in prayer if there's no questions? Okay. Pastor Dooney, would you be able to do that?